Yeah, so I just want to start by inviting you to take a look at who's here. For those of you who have your camera off, you're welcome to keep your camera off, but if you want to turn it on for a moment or two, just so we can see the images of the Sangha, which I will be talking about some, or as part of the conversation this evening. It's really a wonderful thing that we have opportunity to practice together. And it's also part of the heart of the Buddha's awakening was the recognition of our non-separation, of our inextricable interdependence. Yeah. And when we practice meditation, as I was trying to emphasize this evening, we're practicing this quality of intimacy with our own experience. Because so often we can feel kind of separate, alienated. We can even feel like we're sort of observers of our own life. Or we can feel kind of disembodied in some way from what's happening. And the meditation practice is really an invitation to bring our experience and our awareness together as a single whole. And there's something that's quite healing and beautiful, really, in that coming together. And in the same way that that can happen for us individually, that practice of closeness, that practice of intimacy can begin to infuse our experience, as I was describing at the beginning, with our inner objects, our own feelings, our thoughts, our sensations, our breath, but also with what we call external objects. And that includes each other. It includes our food, it includes the trees, it includes the cars, it includes all the objects of the world, that we can begin to feel a sense of connection. And of course, some of the objects we like, whether they're inner or outer, and some of them we don't like. So we can notice all of those parts. We notice the object, we notice the awareness, and we notice the relationship between. And little by little, we begin to feel less rift, less separateness, less tear in the fabric, right? And more of a sense of wholeness, of completeness, of really, in a way, a sense of belonging. I'm getting quite a symphony here from my little dog who was talking to me. No, buddy, I'm busy. He's going, oh, oh. Yeah. So all of that I'm saying is kind of preface to what I'd like to talk about this evening, which is really a kind of celebration and honoring of the holiday tomorrow, which is the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I have been kind of immersing myself in a variety of ways in learning about his life, but also really learning about the community, the people around him that were so essential to the movement, the civil rights movement, that really changed the whole shape and tone and tenor of the United States. Transformed it. And we are in such a moment now in which there is such a need for movements of people who feel the capacity to have an impact. Because I think in this state of this world, there's a lot of sense of, I'm going to give my dog a treat, that's why I'm making a sound. Hang on, you go away. There's a lot of feeling of overwhelm, of despair, of hopelessness. So my hope is that as I share some of the stories with you tonight, that there'll be a sense for you, as there has been for me, of a kind of inspiration, not inspiration in a woohoo, we can, make anything happen, but as a way to ameliorate the kind of hopelessness and despair that I think many people are feeling. So I want to say just a little bit. I think for me, the thing about Dr. King is that he represents this beautiful combination of spiritual life and activism. And I was reflecting today how it is that some of the most profound transformations, cultural transformations, that have happened in the world that, as I've seen it or known it or read about it, have come from those individuals, right? This was true of Gandhi, who was deeply rooted in spiritual practice and also, overthrew the British Empire, right? It's also true of Nelson Mandela, who was a deeply spiritual person who was able to support the movement to upend apartheid in South Africa. And this was really the spirit of Dr. King as well, who most of us know as kind of the figurehead in some way, the voice of the civil rights movement. But he began as a Baptist minister. And he was very young. He was 26 years old when he was drafted to become the head of SNCC and begin to become involved in the civil rights movement. He had to be dragged in to a certain extent. And one of the things that he did that I've been learning about that's so important, I think, is that as a comparatively young man surrounded by these enormous icons of civil rights, he listened. He took in the words, the advice, the wisdom from, the elders, as it were, around him. Somebody sent me today an article that was in the New York Times, and it was titled, "Martin Luther King Was Not a Lone Messiah." And it went on to really describe the movement that he created. And it described, in particular, it named 3 people who were key to the movement. Medgar Evers, Medgar Evans, who was the secretary of the NAACP, and Malcolm X, who he had some disagreements with, but they was a key figure in the movement as well, and James Baldwin. And those are just 3. And what I'm going to be talking about this evening actually are a number of the women who were also key in the involvement in this movement. Because I noticed when I got this article, someone was so kind to send to me, because they knew I was giving a talk. They sent me this article and I read it and I thought, it's all men. Wait a minute, right? And I think it was about 10 years ago, I was one of a group of teachers who was co-leading what's called the Community Dharma Leader Program. Some of you may know about that program through Spirit Rock. And one of the benefits of that program is we get to invite in all these wonderful teachers to come and talk and give presentations to the community of people in the program. And one of the teachers who we invited was Professor Jan Willis, who is a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, 40 years of practice, has written a series of books. And interestingly for me, she was a professor at the school, a college where I went to school. And unfortunately for me, I wasn't yet interested in Buddhism, and I never took a course from her. But she told this story during her presentation for CDL that has stayed with me all this time. And yesterday, actually, I participated in a 2 hour, sort of a 2 hour Dharma talk mini class that she taught through Spirit Rock, in which she talked about some of the key women around Dr. King. So she was kind of fleshing out this, or I'm going to use what I learned from her to flesh this out. But what I want to share is this early story that she told, which I got a little more detail of because she told it again yesterday in the class. And Dr. Willis was a high school student when the civil rights movement and the marches began. And she was one of the young people who would, she described, go by bus to the church after school was over, and then they would march downtown to City Hall. And she said yesterday that Dr. King actually got quite a bit of flack for recruiting young people because it was dangerous what they were doing. You all have probably seen the photos, right, of the fire hoses and the dogs and the guns and the batons. But they were, the young people in that movement were quite passionate about what they were up to. And what she shared was something that is a part of the history I think very few people know, which is, she said, when these high school students would arrive at the church, they were vetted by, this is her language, she described, they were vetted, she said, were vetted by the church ladies. So this congregation of Black women who were part of the church would literally check each person and check in with them and make sure, because these were peaceful protests, right? Dr. King was deeply influenced by Gandhi's nonviolent movement. He was deeply influenced later in his life by Thich Nhat Hanh. And that spirit of nonviolence and of deep groundedness in spiritual practice came through in this process. And what Dr. Willis described yesterday was that these women would check out each student, and if anybody who was preparing to go march had any attitude, you know, like, "Wah, I'm going to go get them," they would say, "You know, you stay back today and just, you know, we'll pray together and calm yourself down," because it was so important that, I mean, you saw what happened, right? They had horrible things right in their face that these, especially these young people, didn't snap, right? So all these years, I've carried this story of these church ladies, and I was remembering, some of you have heard me talk about this. I've been part of a number of groups. Actually, all of them have been groups of women over the last 20 years now that have been dedicated, really devoted to looking at issues around race and racism. And they have been mixed groups that are really been primarily focused on Black and white racism. And most recently, I've been part of a little subset group. There's 3 of us in the group, and we meet every other week, and we kind of do what these church ladies did with each other. We check in with each other, and we listen, and we hear how we're doing, and we give each other a little feedback. And we're not going out to march, but we're providing that kind of mirror for one another. And the thing that is a little bit funny to me, which I hadn't made the connection until I did this class yesterday, is that we call our meetings church. And when I get an invitation to go to church, it says on my, my calendar, it says church ladies. So we call ourselves the church ladies. And I'm sure that that seed was planted those years ago from hearing Dr. Willis give this talk. So this is kind of the seed of understanding the breadth of what's needed for there to be a movement in which real change can occur. And as the New York Times article suggested, that Dr. King wasn't a lone messiah, and as Dr. Willis explained from her own experience, there was a whole body of people, some of whom are more known, some of whom are less known, who were essential to the unfolding of that movement occurring. And this is very much described, explained, articulated by Dr. King himself in his own description of what he called beloved community. Right? So beloved community for him was the whole point. Like the reason that they were marching, the reason that they were overthrowing oppression, the reason all of that was so that the upshot, the end game, would be this community in which each person was fully respected, loved, appreciated. And he actually didn't coin the term beloved community. It came from different, let's see, I've got his name, Josiah Royce, who was a theologian and philosopher. But actually the idea of beloved community, as well as the importance of nonviolence, was really brought very much to Dr. King and to the movement from Bayard Rustin, who I watched there's a new Netflix, it's not a documentary, it's a docudrama, I guess you would call it, about his life. And just in the same way that many of these women, who I'm going to talk about in a few moments, were kind of written out of the history, Bayard also, he was an openly gay man at a time when it was not okay. You know, it was a dangerous thing to be a black man in America. It was double, triple dangerous to be a gay black man in America. And he also was very much kind of written out of the history until recently, when this book and now this movie came out. And the movie really shows that he was, I was going to say the brains behind, but really he was the brains and the passion behind the March on Washington. And he was really responsible for recruiting, what turned into 250,000 people marching peacefully on the Capitol, which is, of course, where we know that Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But just like those church ladies who were vetting all those people, Bayard Rustin was another person who was behind the scenes doing so much of the work that needed to happen in order for this movement to unfold. I've been thinking about the correlation between, beloved community and Dr. King's work, and of course the life and the work of the Buddha, who, we talk about, I've been preparing for this class on refuge, and the refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And Sangha is often, at least in the West, referred to as the kind of forgotten jewel, right? Western convert Buddhists have a lot of interest in meditation and they want to learn the philosophy, but Sangha hasn't been quite as important. And there's a famous story, some of you may know, I don't actually know if it's even a true story, but it's a good one, in which Ananda, who is the Buddha's attendant, comes to the Buddha and excited and says, I understand something. I understand. And the Buddha asks, what do you understand? And he said, the Sangha jewel is fully half of the holy life. Like, that's how important Sangha is. It's half of the holy life. And in these texts, it's often the case that Ananda acts as kind of the foil for the Buddha. So the Buddha says, as he often does to Ananda, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. He's reprimanding him. And he said, the Sangha is fully the whole of the holy life. And in my own studying and looking at, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, each of those jewels, what are called jewels or treasures, can be understood at different levels. So on one hand, the Sangha was the fourfold community of monks and nuns and laymen and laywomen. And even that, there's a hierarchy, right? Most of the history of Buddhism is focused on the monks. The nuns get a little bit of time, and laymen and laywomen get, laymen get very little and laywomen get even less. Right? So that's the first level of Sangha. The second level of Sangha is all of the community, right? The whole community, 2,600 years of thousands and thousands of people of different time and place and culture and language who have taken up these teachings, as we are, and brought them alive, in our lives. That's a broader understanding of the Sangha jewel. But this comes from, in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about each jewel as having outer, inner, and secret meeting, these three levels. So the outer is the historical fourfold Sangha, the inner is the broader Sangha, and the secret of Sangha is this truth of our deep connectedness, this truth of non-separation that I was emphasizing in the meditation, which is the essence of how suffering is undone. Right? And for me, as I've been chewing on this study myself of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, I feel like Sangha, in a word, the essence of Sangha is love. This is the bond that connects rather than the break, the rift that separates, that divides. And this is, I think, at the heart of what the Buddha means when he says, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. The Sangha is fully the whole of the holy life. Because this is the end game, just as it was for Dr. King, that beloved community was the whole point of the movement, that for the Buddha too, that creating a community of kind, wise, awakened beings was the point. We get confused about that sometimes in the West. I think we think, oh, meditation is the point. No, meditation is not the point. You don't meditate to become a good meditator. You meditate because it allows you to learn to be intimate with yourself. And as you become intimate with yourself, you can begin to relate to, right? I talked about awareness and objects and the relationship. The whole of our practice is a reorienting of our relationship to our experience, our inner experience and our outer experience. And it's hard enough to change our inner experience. But when we move out into the world where things get very complex, right? Or in the case of, talking about the civil rights movement, you have people who are being attacked by dogs and batons and fire hoses. It takes a lot to stay nonviolent. It takes a lot not to separate. I'll read you a quote from Dr. King. It's from his sermon that he gave called "Loving Your Enemies." And I think this is really good grist for the mill right now in a world where we have so much divisiveness. And so just to invite you to consider whoever it is who's the bad guy or the bad gal or the bad people in your own mind, to try applying what he's describing here, because it wasn't any easier for him at that time to do this. This is what he says. And I should just say, in what he's addressing here is how it is to create, what's needed, I'll say it that way, to create beloved community. He says, with every ounce of our energy, we must continue to rid this nation of the incubus of segregation. We must do away with the divide. We must do away with the separation. We must do away with the oppression. Yeah? With every ounce of our energy, we must continue to rid this nation of the incubus of segregation. But we shall not, in the process, relinquish our privilege and our obligation to love. While abhorring, hating, detesting, despising segregation, while abhorring segregation, we shall love the segregationist. Try that on. Fill in your own blank, right? You may abhor whoever it is who is doing terrible things, perhaps, but do not hate the person. This is the only way to create beloved community. So one of the things that's really struck me about kind of immersing myself in studying Dr. King's life and seeing the truth that he was the voice of a movement, but he wasn't the whole movement, is the importance of leadership that cares about people. Because what we're seeing in the world today is leadership that doesn't care at all. The leadership that cares about power. That leadership that cares about dividing in order to create power. And is doing immense harm, excruciating harm, right? And at least from the lens that I am looking through, everywhere you look, where there is war, where there is, political divide, where there is climate disaster, what you see are leaders who hate. What you see are leaders who don't care about people, and what you see are really good people on the ground, in Gaza, in Israel. You see people who are being punished by the bad behavior of leaders and systems that don't care, that don't love, that aren't interested in this essential piece of beloved community, right? They're forgetting that that's the point. So let me share a little bit about some of these women who were also essential to the civil rights movement. And at least for me, as I heard their stories, I found myself inspired because these are the three women who Dr. Willis spoke about yesterday, who are Rosa Parks, who many people know of, but actually she's often fairly misrepresented by the press and Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a little less well known, and Ella Baker. And one of the really interesting things about these three women is they're so different. And this strikes me also about if you read the stories of the monks and nuns in the Buddhist Sangha, they're from all different castes. They have very different capacities. And that was true of these three women as well. And for me, it's inspiring because I think it's pointing us to the importance of all of our contribution. That, not everybody has the voice, and the oratory skills of a Dr. King. That's a once in a lifetime, right? That somebody's able to do what he was able to do. But he was one person, and there were hundreds, thousands of people. And the contribution of all of those people, which is a message to all of us, was important. And what each of us does doesn't have to look like what somebody else does. We do our part, right? So I'm going to invite you to hear the stories of these three women in that way. So many of you probably are familiar with the kind of basic story of Rosa Parks, who sat on the bus and wouldn't move. And some of the backdrop of that story that I heard yesterday from Dr. Willis was really great. So first she said, you have to understand how the bus system worked. It was terrible. So Black folks in the South had to use buses to get to work. But the way that the buses worked was that if you were Black, you got on at the front of the bus where the driver was to pay, and then you had to get off the bus and go to the back door to get back on, so you would sit in the back. And she said that the particular bus driver who was driving the bus that Rosa Parks made famous was known to be really an asshole. He was a mean guy. And frequently what he would do is someone would get on the bus, pay their fare, get off, and he would drive away. So it was a terrible system. Anyhow, so Rosa was on the bus sitting in the Black section of the bus. Sometimes I think there's a mistaken notion that she sat down in the white section as a kind of protest, but no, she was sitting in the Black section of the bus, but because there were so many white people getting on the bus, she was asked to move. And that's when she said no. And the line that's often attributed to her is that she said, I'm tired. And she was known to be a devout Christian, church woman, and seamstress who worked, a difficult, tiring job all day. And the presumption is she was tired from her job and she was, her feet hurt and she didn't want to get up. But actually, according to Dr. Willis, that's not what she said. What she said was, I'm tired of it. That's a different statement. She was tired of having to walk to the back, having the bus driver go away, of being told she had to move back. And she said no. The other thing that is often not explained about Rosa Parks is that this didn't happen kind of on whim. That she had been to multiple civil rights nonviolence trainings. So this is like why we do meditation practice. We're practicing something so that when the time comes to take a stand, we have that practice under our belts, which she did. She wasn't just this miraculous person who spontaneously did something. She had gone to multiple rounds of training to prepare herself for that moment. So that was Rosa Parks. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer was she come from a very different background. She was the daughter, there were 20 children in her family, and she was one of 20 kids in a family of sharecroppers. Now, sharecropping is basically slavery, except it's got a different name. So basically, her parents were owned by the people who ran the plantation. They were picking cotton, and they were forced to pick cotton just to be able to keep their house. And they were terribly impoverished. So she describes, her family wrapping rags around the children's feet because they didn't have shoes. She was that kind of poor. And there's two other pieces of her story that are just horrible, really. She had polio as a child, but it was never diagnosed because there was no medical care. So she was poor, and she had a limp. And as an older woman, she got sick and ended up in the hospital, and came out with a hysterectomy, which was often what happened for Black women. They went into the hospital for something and came out sterilized. Right? That was just a normal part of the way things were. So this woman, who had been through so much, was inspired by SNCC, the committee that was sort of headed up by Dr. King in the South. And she got passionate about voter registration. And when the guy who ran the cotton farm found out that she had gone to do voter registration, he said, "We're not ready for that in the South," and said, you won't have a home here anymore. And so she lost her home because she wasn't going to give up. And she continued to take buses and do marches to do voter registration, including being stopped by police in a bus and beaten terribly as a result of the horrible prejudice and resistance to the movement. And Dr. Willis told this amazing story about how in jail, the other people in the jail could hear her being beaten, and that when she came to, she was singing. And that was her spirit, like she just was indomitable. And she played this beautiful clip of her, this, child number 18 of 20, daughter of a sharecropper who wore rags on her feet and had been beaten and had a hysterectomy. She gave this amazing talk to Congress, talking about the importance of the movement. So she's a very different character than Rosa Parks. And the third woman, who I think is worth mentioning, and of course these three represent, the stories of all those church ladies, right? This is a microcosm of the bigger scene. The third woman who Dr. Willis talked about yesterday was Ella Baker. And Ella Baker, interestingly, she was a much more upper class. She was educated. She was kind of like Bayard. She was sort of part of the brains behind the whole movement. She was one of the people who kept things going. And she also really challenged Dr. King with this, especially this idea of leadership. She really felt that leadership needed to be held by the whole community. And she didn't want to give him too much power, really. He was kind of the shining light. And while she loved and respected him, she really felt that she has this great quote. Let's see if I can find it. strong people don't need strong leaders. So her emphasis was really very much like Rustin. She wanted to really pull in the young people and listen to them and empower them rather than having, a single kind of messianic leader. And she was, she's a name that many people know, but perhaps what's unknown is how essential her role was in the movement, just like Rustin's importance on the March on Washington. Just like the quote from John Lewis, who talks about making good trouble. Rustin has this term that he used that I think I found inspiring and maybe useful for some of you, but he talked about the young people who he recruited as angelic troublemakers. And I thought, yeah, we could do that. We could be angelic troublemakers, right? This means we're all looking for how it is that we can stay rooted in love. And love is that place where we can stay close to our experience, where we can stay intimate with, where we're not breaking and separating and dividing, inner or outer, right? And when we know that we're not there, then we shouldn't go on the march, right? Or perhaps you, as I have begun to cultivate for myself, you can create your own body of church ladies, right? Those people around you, maybe your Dharma brothers and sisters and friends who can say, maybe it's time for you to go on retreat, or maybe you just need to be quiet for the day, right? Because, of course, when things are in as much churn as they are now, we need to find the places where we come in and where we go out, where we reground ourselves, resource ourselves, reconnect ourselves, so that when we go out, when we do whatever our role is, and you could be the one who sits on the bus, you could be the one who testifies in front of Congress, you could be the one who organizes, massive protests or runs all the organizations behind the scenes. You could be the one who sings. There's roles for everybody in the troupe of angelic troublemakers, right? You do your part. So this is, I think, I hope, some inspiration for all of our task. Because if we're going to change, and I'm not suggesting that any of us can do this alone, nor that it will be a quick or easy something, but if we're going to be gifted a human life, then we want to do our part, whatever that is. And probably for each of us, unless you are someone like Dr. King, it's going to feel like it isn't enough, because it isn't enough. But the good news is you don't have to do it all. We do it together. And we can take solace in knowing that I'm doing my part and you're doing your part, and we're all doing a little bit, so that we can begin to, what did he say? Have the arc of history lean toward justice. I'm going to leave you with my most favorite Dr. King quote, and then we'll take some of your comments or questions. And it really speaks to this balancing of what he describes as love and power. And I would say perhaps we could think of it as intimacy or compassion, tenderness, and action, engagement. He says, power without love is reckless and abusive. We don't have to look very far to see that. at play. Power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Love is strong. Love is those church ladies saying, no, you are not going to march today. That's love. It's not the kind of pink we're about to have Valentine's Day here, right, in America next month. It's not the pink fluffy version of love. Love is strong. Love is what holds us together. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. And then he says, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. If we're going to have justice, if we're going to have transformation, it has to come through love. Otherwise, it just turns into more injustice, more separation, more violence. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So where we use our power is in service of love, not in service of power. I think it evokes for me, I think, something else that's really important to say, which is that I think that this idea that we carry, especially in the West, of this kind of messianic leader idea is so dangerous. It's dangerous for the leader, and it's dangerous for all of us. It's dangerous for the leaders because if you look at the lives of Dr. King, of Mandela, of Gandhi, you know, these were not perfect people, right? There are all kinds of complaints. Often, just as you were saying, those complaints come from the people closest into them, you know, their family members, their loved ones. That doesn't mean that they're bad people in some way. But we hold these leaders to such a, I think, kind of ridiculous high standard that it means that we give up the possibility of allowing ourselves to be inspired by people. They don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be perfect. We can just do something good and appreciate that part. And of course, as I've been saying, when we hold this idea of the messianic leader, the heroic leader who's going to save us, we give up our own power. We forego our own ability and our own participation. And I struggle with this myself, you know. I just think, ugh, it's too awful. I don't want to. And of course, it's important for us all, to the best of our ability, to find those places where we can be resourced and nourished and etc. Sangha is one of those places. But despair is not a good option at this moment, you know. There's just too much at stake. So I hope that in that spirit, whatever it is, whatever piece of this touches you, whatever piece of it seems important to you, however big or small you may feel your contribution is, that you know it's important. Not just important, it's essential. Because that's the point, is to create this community where together we have the possibility of transforming something. So we're at time, and I just want to thank you all for listening, and it was a great delight to get to share some of these stories. And from really the deepest place in me, I want to offer up with open hands and as much generosity as I can muster that any goodness, any benefit, any inspiration, any insight that may have come from our gathering together this evening, that will be freely and generously shared, that we can send it out to touch the lives of the many, many beings, known and unknown, seen and unseen, all across our beautiful, aching world. Thank you all very much for your kind attention this evening, and wish you a happy Martin Luther King's birthday tomorrow. Thank you all.